About 600 square kilometers of Ukraine's Kherson region underwater after dam destroyed, governor says. About 600 square kilometers, or 230 square miles, of the Kherson region in southern Ukraine was underwater on Thursday following the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric dam. The regional governor said. Governor Alexander Prokudin said 80 of the flooded territory was on the Russian-occupied left bank of the Dnipro River. The average level of flooding in the Kherson region on Thursday morning was 5.61 meters, 18.41 feet. He said, "We're already working. We will help everyone that has ended up in trouble," he said in a video statement of the flooding caused by the collapse of the dam, which is about 60 km upstream from Kherson. Russia, which launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and Ukraine blame each other for the destruction of the Russian-occupied dam on Tuesday. Despite the immense danger and constant Russian shelling, evacuation from zones of flooding is continuing, Prokudin said. He said almost 2,000 people had left flooded territory as of Thursday morning. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in a video address late on Wednesday that it was impossible to predict how many people would die in Russian-occupied areas due to the flooding, hundreds plucked from flooded homes. Ukraine dismisses counter-offensive reports. Hundreds of Ukrainians were rescued from rooftops on Thursday, 2 days after waters from a huge breached dam submerged villages, fields, and roads in the southern region of Kherson, as Kiev dismissed reports its counter-offensive had begun. Drone video showed areas where often only the roofs were visible above the flooding. The region's governor said some 600 square kilometers, or 230 square miles, were underwater. The collapse of the Kakhovka Dam came as Ukraine prepared a counteroffensive, likely the next major phase in the war in which tens of thousands of people have been killed, millions uprooted, and entire cities reduced to ruins since Russia's special military operation began on Feb. 24 last year. Citing a senior officer and a soldier near the front lines, said the offensive had begun. The Washington Post cited 4 individuals in the armed forces saying the same thing. Asked about the reports, a spokesperson for the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces told Reuters, "We have no such information." In its daily Ukraine briefing, Britain's Defense Ministry on Thursday reported heavy fighting along multiple sectors of the front, adding that Kyiv held the initiative in most areas. Ukraine's military said the flooding in Kherson had forced Russian troops to retreat by 5 to 15 km and had practically halved Russian shelling. A senior Russian commander briefed President Vladimir Putin on how his forces had repelled a large-scale Ukrainian attack in the southern Zaporizhzhia region, the TASS news agency reported. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said earlier on Thursday that Russian forces had withstood fierce overnight attempts by Ukrainian troops to break through the front line in Zaporizhzhia and had inflicted heavy losses on them. Trading blame. Russia and Ukraine have traded blame for the bursting of the Soviet-era Kakhovka hydroelectric dam, which sent waters cascading across the war zone of southern Ukraine in the early hours of Tuesday, forcing tens of thousands to flee. Moscow and Kyiv also accused each other on Thursday of shelling the area as rescue workers and rubber dinghies tried to save people and animals from the still-rising floodwaters. Russian shelling wounded at least 9 people in Kherson on Thursday as residents were being evacuated, Ukraine's Interior Ministry said. The Prosecutor General's office initially said 1 person had been killed by the shelling, but later said no deaths had been reported. A Reuters reporter in Kherson said he could hear what appeared to be artillery fire. The Kremlin similarly accused Ukraine of shelling Russian rescue workers in the area. Friends and family of stranded residents posted appeals online with names, photos, and GPS locations of residents. The coordinator of a volunteer group on the Telegram messaging app said the appeals were getting more urgent because people were running out of drinking water. One man, Sergei, told Reuters the last time he spoke with his 83-year-old father-in-law in the Oleshki region was several days before the dam collapse. The latest information is that there was a lot of water in the street, as high as a person, he said. Houses collapsed and went underwater. Ukraine said the floods would leave hundreds of thousands of people without access to drinking water, swamp tens of thousands of hectares of agricultural land, and turn at least 500,000 hectares deprived of irrigation into deserts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has appealed for a clear and rapid international effort to help flood victims, held emergency talks with officials in Kherson, one of 5 Ukrainian regions which Moscow claims to have annexed but only partially controls. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said aid agencies had delivered bottles of drinking water, water purification, tablets, hygiene kits, and jerry cans. Drinking water remains the most pressing need, it said. Mine hazard. The Kremlin said Putin had no plans to visit the region but was monitoring the situation. Putin, without providing evidence, has accused Ukraine of destroying the Russian-controlled dam at the suggestion of its Western allies. Kiev said several months ago the dam had been mined by Russian forces who captured it early in their invasion, and has suggested Moscow blew it up to try to prevent Ukrainian forces crossing the Dnieper River in their counteroffensive. It is not known how many people may have died as a result of the flooding. The Russian-installed mayor of Nova Kakhovka, near the dam site, said on Thursday at least 5 people had died, but the total death toll is sure to be much higher. Kherson's Ukrainian governor, Alexander Prokudin, said 60. The of the flooded territory was on the Russian-occupied left bank of the Dnieper River. The average level of flooding in the Kherson region on Thursday morning was 5.61 meters, 18.41 f2. He said, the water level at the Kakhovka reservoir was approaching a dangerous low, the state company overseeing the facility said on Thursday, saying this could affect the nearby Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station and water supply to other regions. The UN atomic watchdog said on Tuesday the plant, Europe's largest, has enough water to cool its reactors for several months from a pond located above the reservoir. Ukrainian and Russian officials have also warned of the danger posed by mines planted during the war and now scattered by the floods. Moscow-backed official says Russian army gains advantage from Ukraine dam breach. A top Moscow-backed official in part of Ukraine controlled by Russia has said that the collapse of the giant Kakhovka dam has handed the Russian military a tactical advantage, but a prominent U.S. military analyst saw little immediate impact. The vast Soviet-era Kakhovka Dam, under Russian control, was breached in the early hours of Tuesday, unleashing floodwaters across a swath of the battleground in southern Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia blame each other for the episode, which has forced thousands to flee. Some experts say the dam may have collapsed due to earlier war damage and intense pressure on it, caused by the way its gates were operated by Russian-backed authorities. Vladimir Saldo, the Russian-installed governor of part of Ukraine's southern Kherson region, controlled by Moscow, said he believed Kiev was to blame for the disaster, but that the tragedy had handed an advantage to the Russian military. In military terms, the situation has worked out in a way that is operationally and tactically in favor of Russian forces, Saldo told pro-Kremlin TV presenter Vladimir Solovyov. He said the dam's destruction and resulting floodwaters would make it easier for Russia to defend against any Ukrainian counteroffensive in the area. The Ukrainians counteroffensive in the area, hurt themselves by doing this. Their calculation was that by blowing up the dam, they would give some strategic or operational advantage to the Ukrainian armed forces, but they will not be able to do anything, he said. Our armed forces now have an open space in front of them across which they can see who is trying to cross the Dnieper River and how. And it will be impossible for them to get through via the Kakhovka reservoir if they try. Moscow controls the east bank of the Dnieper while Ukrainian forces are deployed on its west bank. Michael Kaufman, an expert on the Russian military at the US-based think tank, said he was skeptical the disaster would hamper Ukraine's near-term military plans for a counteroffensive. I doubt it will have a significant impact on Ukrainian military operations. The Kakhovka Dam is at least 100 miles from where much of the activity might take place at its closest point, Kaufman said on Twitter. A Ukrainian cross-river operation in southern Kherson below the dam was always a risky and therefore low probability prospect. There is no evidence that such an operation was underway or would have necessarily been a part of the Ukrainian offensive plans, he said. Nor did the dam's destruction substantially shorten Russian lines, he added, and the ensuing floods would probably also destroy the first line of Russia's own defensive entrenchments on the side of the river it controls. Ukraine wary of floating mines disease spreading after Kakhovka dam collapse. Ukraine warned of the danger of floating mines unearthed by flooding and the spread of disease and hazardous chemicals on Wednesday as senior officials inspected damage caused by the collapse of the vast Kakhovka hydroelectric dam. Visiting the city of Kherson on the Dnipro River that bisects the country, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Kubrakov said that over 80 settlements had been affected in a disaster which Ukraine and Russia blame on each other. Blaming the dam's collapse on Russia, Kubrakov said, they did it in order to free up troops in this direction by flooding this bit of the front line. Russia, whose troops seized the dam soon after they invaded in February last year, has said Ukraine sabotaged the dam to distract attention from a counteroffensive it said was faltering. I can't even speak now. I can't collect myself, said Lubov Berry, 67, who was evacuated from Kherson to a hospital on Tuesday with her 40-year-old son Roman. I'm of course awfully angry at the Russians. I can't even describe it. I don't know what awaits us. Our house seems to be destroyed, she said. Regional Governor Alexander Prokudin said the water had reached a depth of 5.34 meters, 17.5 ft. In some places of Kherson, though he said the rise had slowed and could peak by the end of Wednesday. In Kherson, a large city, about 60 km, 37 miles, downstream from the destroyed dam, residents have set up makeshift embarkation points for dinghies that police, rescue workers, and volunteers are now using to get around. Kherson faces the Russian-controlled eastern bank of the Dnipro, and some residents have come under fire from Russian artillery as they go about their rescue and recovery work. The thud of artillery is heard almost constantly in the distance. Water is disturbing mines that were laid earlier, causing them to explode. Kubrakov, dressed casually in a gray t-shirt, told reporters as a result of the flooding, chemicals and infectious bacteria were getting into the water, he said. He said Ukraine had allocated 120 million hryvnias, $3.25 million, allocated to secure the water supply in Mykolaiv, another southern city, and 1.5 billion hryvnias had been set aside to rebuild water main systems ruined by the flood. Evacuation. The chief doctor of a Kherson hospital, who asked not to be named because he did not want the hospital to risk retribution, said 136 people had been admitted for treatment because of the flooding. Many were elderly. These people had difficulties with their psychological state. These are usually older people. Some of these people have chronic illnesses which could get worse, the doctor said. Ukrainian authorities have evacuated people from 24 flooded settlements, and at least 20 settlements are flooded on territory occupied by Russian forces, Kubrakov said. We see that the occupation authorities are not evacuating people, he said, calling for the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross to help evacuate flood victims in Russian-occupied regions. Kherson, a city of 279,000 before Russia's full-scale invasion in February last year, was occupied by Russian forces for over 8 months until November. Kubrakov said the water level in the city had risen by 12.16 km an hour on Tuesday, but was now rising at 1.2 km an hour. It's one of the most terrifying terrorist acts of this war, he said.